Between 1984 and 1985, a shadow crept across Los Angeles and San Francisco, killing 13 confirmed victims, terrorizing dozens more, and leaving the city paralyzed with fear. His name, Richard Ramirez, later dubbed the Night Stalker. A man whose crimes shocked America and made headlines around the world. In this documentary, we'll uncover the chilling story behind the murders, the investigation that captured him, and the darkness that drove him. Residents locked doors, installed extra locks, and whispered prayers each night. Nobody knew when or where the Night Stalker would strike next. The attacks were random, brutal, and carried out with chilling confidence. According to LAPD reports, some victims were attacked in their own homes, moments after returning from work or late-night outings. Investigators were baffled. The killer seemed invisible, leaving only fear in his wake. Richard Ramirez was not just a criminal, he was a symbol of terror. Psychologists later noted his fascination with Satanism and violent imagery, while neighbors described him as quiet, unassuming, and even polite in casual encounters. According to court records, this duality, appearing normal in public while committing horrific crimes in secret, made him even more terrifying. His randomness, unpredictability, and the sheer brutality of his acts earned him the moniker Night Stalker, a name that would haunt Los Angeles forever. The first confirmed attacks occurred in June 1984, targeting homes in the San Gabriel Valley. Victims were mostly elderly or living alone. The attacks escalated to a frightening pattern, sometimes breaking in, other times climbing through unlocked windows. Newspapers described residents barricading doors, children refusing to sleep alone, and a city gripped by fear. In just a year, Ramirez would claim 13 confirmed victims, with dozens more narrowly escaping death. Despite multiple near misses, Ramirez remained free, leaving everyone to wonder, who would be next? Law enforcement struggled to find leads as Ramirez's attacks spread. Detectives studied fingerprints, shoe prints, and eyewitness accounts, trying to piece together the puzzle. Meanwhile, media coverage exploded. According to the Los Angeles Times, every attack dominated headlines, with nightly TV broadcasts showing graphic images and interviews with terrified residents. The fear of a stranger lurking in the dark had become a national sensation. While the city slept in fear, Ramirez continued his spree with shocking boldness. Investigators were closing in, but the killer remained elusive, striking fear into even the bravest. In the next section, we'll explore his early life, the roots of his violent tendencies, and how the man behind the Night Stalker became one of America's most notorious killers. What events in his childhood could have shaped a man capable of such horrors? Let's find out.
To truly understand the darkness that would one day grip Los Angeles, we must step far away from the neon lights of the 1980s. We must go back to the quiet neighborhoods of El Paso, Texas, back to the childhood of a boy who seemed ordinary, almost invisible, yet carried within him the seeds of a future that no one could have imagined. Richard Ramirez entered the world on February 29, 1960, a leap-year baby, the youngest of 5 children in a hardworking Mexican-American family. According to later court documents and archived interviews, his early years were shaped by long hours, strict discipline, and a home filled with tension. His parents had immigrated for a better future, but the reality was far from easy. His father, Julian, worked physically demanding jobs on the Santa Fe Railroad. Family acquaintances described him as a man whose temper could explode without warning, sometimes leaving Richard seeking refuge outdoors, wandering alone through the streets until late into the evening. Those lonely hours became a habit, and eventually, a comfort. But the most powerful force in young Richard's life was his older cousin, Miguel, known to everyone simply as Mike. According to Los Angeles Times archives and testimony presented years later in court, Mike had served in the Vietnam War. He returned home carrying not just scars, but memories of brutal combat that he recounted with disturbing pride. Richard was just 12 when Mike began showing him Polaroids, photos taken during the war that displayed scenes no child should ever witness. Images of violence. Images of power. Images that, according to psychologists who later studied Ramirez, may have shaped his understanding of dominance and fear. But it wasn't just the photographs. It was what came next, an event that would shock the entire Ramirez family, and mark the beginning of a drastic shift in Richard's behavior.
One afternoon in 1973, while Richard sat with his cousin in the living room, Mike and his wife began arguing. According to police records referenced in later reporting, the shouting escalated. And then, without warning, Mike raised a handgun and shot her. Richard, frozen in place, saw everything. The horror unfolded right before him. It was a moment that investigators would later describe as psychologically shattering. While Mike was taken into custody, Richard was left in a house that suddenly felt darker, heavier, and filled with a silence that echoed long after the gunshot. According to reports from the time and later psychiatric evaluations, Richard changed almost immediately. He became distant, detached, and for the first time, he began withdrawing into a world that no one else could fully access. After the incident, family members tried to bring stability back into Richard's life, but something had already shifted inside him. He sought escape anywhere he could find it. Some nights he slept in a local cemetery, claiming he felt peaceful there. Other times he wandered El Paso's back streets until dawn. According to archived interviews with former schoolmates published by the Washington Post, Richard's classmates remembered him as quiet, expressionless, and increasingly unpredictable. Teachers described him as a child who seemed present in body, but absent in mind, a boy staring at something no one else could see. As he entered his teenage years, Richard's behavior escalated further. He fell in with older teens who introduced him to drugs, particularly marijuana and cocaine. He began stealing, breaking into homes not for money but for the thrill. According to old police incident logs reviewed during his later trial, Ramirez was involved in multiple minor burglaries as a teen, though no serious consequences followed. But perhaps the most disturbing shift was something far more subtle, something almost no one noticed at the time. Richard began developing a deep fascination with dark symbolism, occult drawings, and satanic literature. Prosecutors would later reveal that he collected books, symbols, and sketches that suggested an obsession with power and fear. Neighbors recalled seeing him walking late at night, whispering to himself, sometimes staring into the distance as if entranced. To the outside world, he was still just a troubled kid, another teenager headed down a rough path, but under the surface, a much darker identity was forming. By the late 1970s, Richard was no longer simply drifting. He was descending, frustrated with school, alienated from his family, and increasingly absorbed in dangerous habits. He made a decision that would ultimately change the course of his life and the fate of countless others. He left Texas for Los Angeles, a city of lights, a city of shadows, a place where millions moved unnoticed, and where someone like Richard Ramirez could disappear into the crowd. But Los Angeles wasn't just a new beginning for him, it was the birthplace of the Night Stalker. In the next section, we'll explore Ramirez's early adult years, the crimes he committed before the murders, the signs that investigators later realized were warnings, and how the escalation began long before anyone knew his name. What turned a troubled young man into a predator? And could anyone have stopped him before it was too late?
By the early 1980s, Richard Ramirez had become a ghost in Los Angeles. He had no stable job, no permanent address, and no meaningful relationships connecting him to the real world. According to police background investigations cited during his trial, Ramirez drifted between cheap motels, abandoned buildings, and public parks, surviving through petty theft and drug use. To the city around him, he was invisible. Former acquaintances described him as increasingly detached from reality. People who encountered him during this period reported erratic behavior, sudden mood changes, long silences, and strange fixations. According to interviews later published by the San Francisco Chronicle, some people recalled him talking about feeling powerful when breaking into homes. As if trespassing gave him a sense of control he lacked everywhere else in life. At first, these break-ins were not violent. Ramirez targeted unlocked houses, stealing small items, and disappearing without being noticed. Police incident reports show a pattern of minor burglaries across multiple neighborhoods, often with no signs of forced entry. The crimes appeared random, scattered without a clear geographic trail, making them almost impossible for early investigations to connect. But something darker was happening beneath the surface. Psychological experts later testified that Ramirez's escalating substance abuse, particularly cocaine, combined with his obsession with violent fantasy, began to blur the line between imagination and action. In court statements, experts described how his fantasy shifted from thoughts of power to urges for direct physical dominance. Eventually, the trespassing wasn't enough. Night after night, Ramirez began lingering longer inside victim homes, watching, listening, observing people while they slept. According to evidence introduced during trial proceedings, in several early incidents, victims later recalled sensing movement or noise inside their homes, only to assume it was nothing. At that stage, Ramirez often fled without confrontation, not yet ready to act on his darkest impulses. But the escalation had already begun. The more he entered these private spaces unseen, the stronger his thrill became, and the weaker his inhibitions grew. Experts noted that this pattern, voyeurism leading into physical assault, is a documented progression seen in many serial offenders. By early 1984, Ramirez was no longer satisfied with silent theft. The internal fantasies that had fueled his behavior now demanded expression. The attacks became more aggressive. Victims began reporting sudden intrusions where the intruder did not flee, instead confronting them directly. According to early police bulletins, some cases involved sudden assaults followed by immediate escapes without theft, indicating that control, not money, had become the primary motive. Investigators later linked these incidents into what would become the earliest recognizable phase of the Night Stalker pattern. However, at the time, no one saw it coming. Different precincts were investigating what seemed like separate crimes, burglaries in one area, assaults in another, attempted attacks elsewhere, but no centralized linkage existed yet. This gap allowed Ramirez to continue roaming freely throughout California. His invisibility remained his greatest weapon. By mid-1984, the progression crossed an irreversible line. The first confirmed murders occurred. Ramirez transitioned from intruder to killer. Forensic reviews later revealed that the attacks followed no consistent method: different weapons, changing tactics, varying victim profiles. Investigators believe this inconsistency delayed identification of a single suspect because there was no reliable signature linking the crimes together. According to archived LAPD task force notes, detectives initially suspected multiple offenders rather than one roaming killer. Meanwhile, public panic began spreading. Unknowingly, in response to a threat authorities themselves had not yet fully recognized. Los Angeles residents increased home security, installing locks, bars, neighborhood watch patrols. But the danger remained unknown and unseen. And Richard Ramirez continued to move through the darkness. In the next section, we will uncover the turning point, the moment authorities realized a serial predator was stalking Southern California, the creation of the Night Stalker task force, and the evidence trail that finally began pointing toward a single name. How did the hunt for one of America's most feared killers finally begin? That story comes next. By late 1985, the pattern could no longer be ignored. What once appeared as scattered burglaries and isolated assaults had begun forming a terrifying mosaic. Across Los Angeles County, victims described the same nightmare: unlocked windows, forced entry in the dead of night, sudden violence, and a dark figure vanishing before police ever arrived. According to LAPD internal memorandums leaked to the press months later, investigators finally reached an alarming realization. These were not separate crimes. They were the work of a single roaming predator. The media needed a name, and soon one would be born. After a televised report referred to the unidentified suspect as the Night Stalker, the nickname exploded across newspapers, radio, and evening news broadcasts. Overnight, the killer had an identity, even before police had a suspect. But the name fueled fear more than clarity. Panic surged. Locks sold out across Southern California. Gun shops reported increased purchases. Neighborhood watch programs sprang up almost overnight. According to the Los Angeles Times, emergency phone calls tripled during late-night hours. Not because of confirmed crimes, but because frightened residents reported shadows, sounds, and suspicious movements that may not have existed at all. Fear itself had become a weapon. Inside the LAPD, pressure reached a breaking point. Officials formed a multi-agency task force, pulling together detectives from homicide, burglary, and forensic units. Their mission was singular: find the Night Stalker before the next victim fell. Detectives flooded crime scenes, comparing shoe prints, fingerprints, tool marks, and victim testimonies. Slowly, details emerged. One critical clue kept reappearing: a distinct footprint, later identified as an Avia footwear imprint. It became the first tangible thread connecting multiple crime scenes. According to forensic analysts, the shoe size was unusually large and the tread pattern rare enough that only a limited number of shoes matched. Police ordered local retailers to report any suspicious purchases. But the streets of Los Angeles remained flooded with fear, and still, Ramirez slipped through the cracks. The attacks continued. In March 1985, an elderly woman was brutally assaulted inside her home in Rosemead. Weeks later, in Monterey Park, another intrusion occurred, strikingly similar: forced entry, immediate violence, minimal theft. It became undeniable: the killer was escalating. Police studied geographic patterns and traced clusters of attacks following public transportation routes. According to transit records analyzed by the task force, someone was moving fluidly from neighborhood to neighborhood, leaving no consistent base location. The predator had learned to blend. Meanwhile, public interest reached dangerous levels. Sensational headlines dominated front pages. The Night Stalker still at large. Who will be next? Television stations published suspect sketches, often inaccurate. Innocent men were chased, assaulted, and even wrongfully accused by frightened residents acting on rumors. According to ACLU filings from that period, multiple civilians were hospitalized after being attacked by vigilantes who mistook them for the killer. Fear was no longer contained to the criminal. It had infected the city itself. Within police headquarters, exhaustion mounted. Detectives worked double shifts. Officers slept in their cars between calls. Leads poured in, too many, overwhelming an already strained system. Then, finally, a breakthrough. In May 1985, Ramirez left behind a partial fingerprint at a crime scene. The print was smudged, incomplete, but enough to begin searching. However, no matching record existed in California databases, so police expanded the search nationwide. Weeks passed with no match, until June. The fingerprint finally returned a name: Richard Ramirez, a drifter from Texas with a history of petty crime, drug use, and minor arrests, including a brief incarceration that had finally put his fingerprints on file. For the first time since the nightmare began, the Night Stalker was no longer faceless. He was real. Detectives rushed to assemble surveillance teams. Mugshots circulated internally. Stakeouts were planned. But there was a chilling problem. No one knew exactly where Ramirez was. He could be anywhere, sleeping on park benches, hiding near bus stations, drifting between low-cost motels. The manhunt began. But the predator was still on the loose, and while police finally had a name, Richard Ramirez was still killing. In the next section, we will follow the citywide hunt as it reached fever pitch, the surveillance breakdowns, media leaks, and the dramatic moment when ordinary citizens would unexpectedly become the ones to stop the Night Stalker forever. The end was approaching, but nobody knew how violent it would be. But the most unsettling part of the story was still ahead. Inside the house, the one everyone avoided, the one people dismissed as just another urban legend, something else was happening. Something no one could fully explain. Witnesses reported a faint whispering sound coming from inside the walls, a soft, shifting murmur that grew louder whenever someone stood alone in the dark. Some said it felt as if a presence moved past them, brushing their shoulder, lingering just behind them. Several investigators claimed they saw a figure, a half-formed silhouette appearing near the doorway, then on the staircase, and sometimes directly behind them. But every time they turned around, nothing was there. Those who tried to uncover the truth either went silent or were never quite the same again. A few insisted the presence inside that house wasn't just a memory. It was still there, waiting, watching. And if you want us to continue this investigation further, uncovering the next chapter of this chilling story, make sure to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Because the real truth is only just beginning. By the summer of 1985, Los Angeles had reached a breaking point. The crimes were escalating, the public was terrified, and investigators were exhausted. Every night brought new calls, new reports, and new fear. But on one crucial night, the case took a turn that would finally shift the balance. It started with something small, a footprint. During one of the crime scene examinations, detectives discovered a clear impression left in soft soil near a bedroom window. According to LAPD's later statements, the print belonged to a rare Avia sneaker, a model so uncommon at the time that only a few pairs had ever been sold in California. For the first time, investigators had something unique, something traceable. This footprint would become one of the most important pieces of physical evidence in the entire investigation. Meanwhile, survivors who had narrowly escaped Ramirez were now able to provide detailed descriptions of the intruder. Tall, thin, dark curly hair, large eyes, a rotting smile. Their accounts differed in small ways, but the fear was identical. Several confirmed seeing the same man. The separate puzzle pieces were finally starting to align. But the breakthrough didn't end there. Shortly afterward, Ramirez made a mistake. During one late-night break-in, he touched the interior mirror of a vehicle parked outside the home. When forensic specialists dusted it, they recovered a partial fingerprint. It wasn't enough for a full match, not yet, but it narrowed the possibilities. Detectives felt the shift. What once felt like an endless chase now had direction. According to archived LAPD task force notes, this was the moment the investigation evolved from confusion to pursuit. As pressure grew, law enforcement agencies across California began sharing information more quickly. Burglaries, assaults, home invasions, and attempted attacks were finally being connected under one umbrella. One man. One predator. The Night Stalker. Public fear reached its highest point. Neighborhood watch groups patrolled streets. Hardware stores sold out of locks, bars, and alarm systems. Families slept with lights on, and some residents even camped out in groups, afraid to stay alone. Yet despite all precautions, Ramirez continued striking. Sometimes miles apart, sometimes only days apart. Investigators believed he was becoming bolder, even reckless, relying purely on instinct and opportunity. But every action left behind something. A smudge, a footprint, a trace. And these traces were beginning to form a trail, one that would finally lead investigators straight to Richard Ramirez. In the next section, we'll uncover the moment of identification, the release of the suspect's face to the public, and how a single day turned the hunter into the hunted. And before we move forward, if you're finding this investigation gripping, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next section as we reach the final chapters of the Night Stalker case. By late August 1985, the city of Los Angeles was living on edge. Police finally had a name, a face, a suspect. But knowing who the Night Stalker was did not mean they knew where he was. When authorities released Richard Ramirez's photograph to the media, the reaction was immediate and explosive. According to contemporaneous reports, phone lines at police stations were overwhelmed within hours. Tips poured in from across the city, many of them contradictory, fueled by fear and urgency. Ramirez had become the most recognizable fugitive in America, but the exposure made him dangerous. Investigators later admitted that the media release, while necessary, may have accelerated his behavior. Ramirez knew he was being hunted, and desperation often breeds recklessness. On August 24, 1985, Ramirez attempted to continue his pattern. But this time, something went wrong. Residents recognized him. What followed was not a coordinated police arrest, but a spontaneous, chaotic moment driven by public terror. According to court records and eyewitness testimony, civilians pursued Ramirez through neighborhoods as word spread that the Night Stalker had been spotted. He was beaten, restrained, and held until police arrived. The predator who had terrorized an entire region for over a year was finally in custody. For Los Angeles, the nightmare was over. But for investigators, the case was only entering its most complex phase. Richard Ramirez's trial became a media spectacle. Courtrooms overflowed. Journalists from around the world gathered to witness the proceedings. According to official court transcripts, Ramirez showed no remorse. often smirking, staring directly at cameras, and making unsettling gestures. Prosecutors laid out the evidence methodically: forensic links, eyewitness testimony, survivor accounts, and the trail of violence that spanned multiple counties. The jury deliberated for weeks. In 1989, Richard Ramirez was convicted on multiple counts of murder, attempted murder, sexual assault, and burglary. He was sentenced to death, a verdict that brought relief to some and unanswered questions to many others. Because despite the conviction, one truth remained deeply unsettling. The Night Stalker had no single motive, no consistent pattern, no clear explanation. Psychologists later described him as a product of trauma, substance abuse, and violent fantasy, but even these explanations felt incomplete. Ramirez died in prison in 2013, but his story did not end there. The Night Stalker case permanently changed how law enforcement approached serial crimes. It reshaped media responsibility, forensic coordination, and public awareness. More importantly, it left behind survivors, people whose lives were forever altered by one man's shadow. This was not just the story of a killer. It was the story of fear, of a city pushed to its limits, and of how darkness can move unnoticed, until it's finally forced into the light. If you found this documentary insightful and want us to continue exploring real cases, untold histories, and the stories behind the headlines, make sure to subscribe to the channel and join us for the next investigation, because some stories don't end with answers. They end with lessons.